is where TV series, which just like that. Actually, I think it's a terrible name. I would have said better name would be something like sex and identity politics.
Instead of achieving a more equal and inclusive series, it's very awkward and sometimes it's very uncomfortable to watch. Now, at some point, the narrative of the series in every episode stops, and a moment of preaching begins, and it achieves the one thing that movies and TV shows should never do, which is that it stops showing and it starts telling.
We literally live in a world where if your phone is not up to latest software system, you can't use some apps, you can't download some things, you are on the edge of becoming obsolete yourself unless you strive to keep up with these trends. However, what I think article fails to acknowledge, as time goes on, just like Sex in the City, things don't go away, they just evolve and change. And therefore, I would still assume and I would argue sex does sell. It's just a very different version.
That is, uh, we want to convince ourselves that everything is linguistically created. We want to convince ourselves that we are good, that we don't need to have sexually charged images, and therefore, Victoria's Secret becomes all of a sudden unfashionable. But then, coincidentally, Ludovic de Saint-Cernin, which does the same thing, just using boys, becomes very popular. So how's that possible? Why one is wrong and the other one is not? And I think to some extent there is a huge misunderstanding and a great deal of hypocrisy in doing this.
Hey, well, hello. Happy New Year, Druby. Culture Gone Bad is back.
Yes, happy new year. And let's hope that this new year is not going to go as bad as our culture is, because we've had enough with 2021.
Well, I still don't hold my breath on culture not going bad though, because this is what keeps us entertained and our listeners as well.
Yeah, also let's tell the people why we are how we are online and we are in different rooms is because for me what happens that the first of 2021 I found out I was COVID positive even though I'm very well and I've got no symptoms at all, but I'm isolating. What about you?
Yes, Drupi, same. I think I only have three words to say. Culture gone COVID. So
Or even COVID gone bad is interchangeable. So basically, that was a good way of starting my new year. Um, yeah.
well,
We,
at least it's going to be out of our list of this year things to do. So
exactly,
maybe in
exactly,
hindsight.
exactly. I'm convincing myself it's gonna count as a fourth jab, as a fourth booster. So, yeah.
So yeah, Drippy, how did you like just like that?
It's complicated because to me, in just like that is the nth experiment, the nth postmodern experiment of recycling the past. The problem is that on the one hand we are creatively castrated, unable to create new things, and therefore we look at the past to find ideas. On the other hand, every time we do so, we are unable to handle and to face the past, and that is because the past was a different country. The past had different values. The past had different preoccupations, a different social and economic society. Therefore, the problem with it, just like that, is that it tries to use to recreate the great series of the past, minus the fun of the past, minus the how can I say, the easy approach to life. Everything is problematic, and the series, I think, is obsessed with mainly, and this was also, I was very surprised because this was also mentioned in the New York Times, but I completely agreed with it. it's obsessed by mainly two things. One thing is that is obsessed with ageism and age, not ageism, but age. They are constantly mentioning their age and making jokes about their bones and the fact that they are 50 years old and they have to pee, or the fact that they've got menopause. Like they treat like being 50 as if it was being 85. So essentially, there is no. They treat like being middle aged today is like it's still being young. It's not a problem. But they approach. So basically, the idea is that if you are over 50, you are done. And interestingly, this links also with another aspect of the series, which is this forced politically correct wokeism. Can you see me properly?
I can see you really well, Juppie, and beyond that, I can hear you really well as well.
Perfect. No, because my video was being crazy. So what I was saying is that the second topic that caught my attention is this forced, politically correct wokeism, whereby they not only are old, but they are also unable to face society. And it always looks like they are 50 years old women, 55 years old women, that they essentially they went from being 30 in the 90s to being 55 in 2020 without having aged in the meantime. So they are all of a sudden old and they don't know how to face society. So they don't know how to speak to black people. They don't know how to speak to Indian people. They don't know how to speak to transgender people. They don't know how to do anything. And there is this constant awkwardness, almost as if they don't belong to this society, almost as if they come from they didn't evolve together with society. So instead of achieving a more equal and an inclusive series, it's very awkward and sometimes it's very, very, very uncomfortable to watch. Also, I think that's the series was very much criticized for the casting before it was even made. So they tried to I think that what they're trying to do is they're trying to prevent criticism, but they are failing at it. They are challenging and they're failing at it because every time there is one of these situations, it becomes extremely awkward, and what is worse, it loses the sense of fun. The narrative stops, the story stops, and a whole moment of preaching begins, almost as if the actresses were priests. So they are obsessed by getting the right pronouns, speaking correctly to the person of color, as it's very fashionable to say today, etc., etc. And it's not natural. That's not how real people behave in society today. Thanks God, that's not how people behave. We have natural, otherwise the interracial friendships or relationships would be unthinkable, would be impossible. And same thing would be impossible to have a trans or gender non-conforming friend if you were constantly saying the wrong thing or afraid to offend. You know what I mean? It's not natural. This does not show a society that is inclusive. This shows a society that is not able to be inclusive, that is not able to face, even with the best ambitions, is not able to face its own complexity. Now, at some point, the narrative of the series in every episode stops, and a moment of preaching begins, and it achieves the one thing that movies and TV shows should never do, which is that it stops showing and it starts telling. Good movies are movies that, and even good books, good narrative is always a narrative that shows without telling. Okay, you don't need to stop the story and start preaching. And these predicaments are extremely political in the sense that they look like political speeches. They don't look like anything that is homogeneous or that belongs to the narrative. It doesn't belong to the narrative. If I wanted to be lectured, I would go to church. If I wanted to hear some sermon, I would go to church. I wouldn't watch Sex and the City.
Oh.
Just tell me a fun story and treat diversity as a normal thing, not as a thing that needs to be addressed all the time, because you're obtaining the opposite effect. Having said that, I am still watching it. There are moments of enjoyment, but those moments of enjoyment are sort of more something that comes from the past. It's like a relic from the past. Everything that is contemporary is misleading. So that's my.
Hmm. I would be very, very curious to see what sort of lectures we can get from church, Droopy Wall.
Well, if you want to be lectured on humankind, church has a very strong um, ethical stand on it and philosophical even. So they would tell you how they would give you their own direction, which is exactly the same thing that certain activists do. They are
Church and a city.
yeah, it's a church without God. They are based on on a system of belief, not on a system of proven observation. That's why I made the comparison with church. But I don't need to be lectured when I watch a TV show. Just do things naturally because it's annoying otherwise, and not just to me. Um, yeah, because
Yeah,
the main
you
criticism
know,
that I hear around and I agree with. Yeah, sorry, go on.
no, all good. For me, when I started watching the first episode, something which struck me, I was convinced for the first 20 minutes that it was some sort of a mocking joke. I could not believe that it was actual episode which has already begun. I literally was waiting for the moment they're gonna say, right, that was all a dream or some sort of a funny intro, and now we're going to let the real TV series begin. And halfway through the first episode, I realized, no, you're trying to convince yourself in something which will never happen. This is the TV series, which just like that. Actually, I think it's a terrible name. I would have said better name would be something like sex and identity politics. At least it would have
So you know
reflected.
what? Is no sex in the city.
Yeah, only preaching.
Sex is only acceptable if you are somehow non-binary, but straight sex is not acceptable anymore. Even Miranda, did you see that?
To be honest, like considering we're struggling to use toilet independently, sex would be next advanced level in these circumstances. But yeah, absolutely. I think the point you mentioned about them trying to nostalgically masturbate on 90s TV series, which everyone loved, is super obvious. And it is incredibly relevant. It looks like we almost stayed the same. And something which really shocked me was including the narrative. Another element is visual, because we're super visual. I thought a lot of styling looked like we were still stuck in these days of original TV series.
Yeah.
Um, Charlotte is still dressed like some sort of a 50s housewife. Nothing has changed. I think a lot of outfits, they look completely out of time. And even though we do have 2000s and 90s fashion revival at the moment, but the way we're styled, it does not look contemporary. It looks like we're still living
You know that
in these old days.
yeah, this is very, very true. This is something that also the New York Times noted in one recent article that came out. They were commenting on the fact that even there is in one of the, not in the latest episode, but in the one before, there is Carrie. I think so. Yeah, there is Carrie, that is wearing a tutu, a very long tutu, and what they noticed that is the same type of tutu that she was wearing in the song of the first of the first series, in the intro of the first series. So it's a direct because she goes to the old house and almost she starts dressing as she used to. But fashion is the one thing that changes constantly, so that doesn't really matter.
Yeah. And then on the narrative level, it was very cute to watch them in their late 20s, mid 30s, like chasing some sort of dreams, living in a big city, having fun, all the friendships, sex encounters, all the exciting things which come in a life in big capital. And maybe them sort of making mistakes or being disillusioned with what we were looking for. But you sort of would guess when you get the 50s and 60s, you will know better than that, than to continue chasing same aspirations and identifying with your children, husband, clothes you have, house in which you live. I felt what all the embodiment of their experience was a very mediocre lifestyle. And that's why essentially all of them are equally unhappy and disappointed, even though we all seem to have achieved everything we've been inspiring for since the beginning of TV series. And I think it's kind of shocking and very sad what they, after living with long lives, even on a TV series perspective, we haven't achieved anything else in sort of their understanding of who we are, what we like, what we're looking for. We're still same confused and very mediocre women in the end of the day. It could sound like a very cruel thing I'm saying, but I felt like you would expect, especially with resources and lifestyles we could have potentially lived, there would be more profound idea communicated to us in this TV series. And I saw none on that. I only thought it was awkward and sort of demonstrated their inability to exist in contemporary society with its dynamics and how it's changing, but simultaneously them not shifting their aspirations and being guided to achieve the same goals we had like 20 years ago. And that didn't work 20 years ago. Well, guess what? Maybe it's time to review what you're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, for me is the frivolousness of the characters is not necessarily a bad thing for me personally, but I can understand that it's different from different people, because it's a TV show, it's a TV series, it's okay. The problem is that they try to, as you say, to maintain the same frivolousness without the same lightness. And they try to put deep goals and deep meanings, and yet being frivolous. And the what happens when you try to do these two things, when you approach frivolousness without lightness, is that you become superficial. You stop being frivolous. So to me, it's like a failed attempt at depth, and also a failed attempt at frivolousness, because it's just very heavy to watch. So yeah, but it's interesting what you say, that actually they didn't really grow, and it's somehow what I was trying to say before as well. They were 30 and now they're 55, and they have aged without growing. And yeah, and everybody else around them perceives them as expired objects to be thrown away. So yeah.
Yeah, you know what? I didn't see any frivolousness in this TV series. And I think maybe for me, the person who was truly frivolous was Samantha, who is absent from this series. But essentially, I actually think we all settled for very average and mediocre lifestyle, like I said before. So in a way, I think they're trying to be playful and exciting, but in reality, they are super average. And no amount of fashion or consumer culture experience can bring more definition to them. So therefore, yes, I absolutely enjoyed seeing them again. Just like you said, it had this nostalgic revival, but it didn't bring any newness or contemporary relevance to the experience.
No, zero. I'll carry on watching it anyway, so.
Yeah, I mean, might as well finish what we've started.
Exactly. No, also it's so difficult to find good things that to watch, that even this seems bearable.
Well, on the level of good things, there's a new collaboration between Prada and Adidas, which was recently launched. And it has a bit, it's Prada nylon, so it's made from recycled nylon. And it's a very interesting uh, direction for Prada, which we know to be such a exclusive, a very elevated aesthetic brand to collaborate with Adidas. And this is probably my personal bias, obviously growing up in post-Soviet Union. With Adidas stripes, I do associate it with, teenagers smoking fags around the, corners of houses in dodgy neighborhoods. And suddenly you have Prada next to Adidas logo. In my mind, again, it's a sort of a Balenciaga aesthetic, which completely removes any social class or boundaries or high and low aesthetics, blurring it all into contemporary perspective in our society where everything lost its original meaning. What did you think, Jupi?
Um, I didn't look at this collaboration from this point of view, but from another point of view, I'll tell you in a minute. But now you are making me think about this, and actually, it's absolutely true. I did a study. I wrote a paper about exactly about what you're saying about how the so-called chav aesthetic of the was perceived chav when we were growing up, in the 90s and early 2000s, at some point became extremely poisonous to fashion, and fashion has avoided anything with logos or that was perceived trash. And then I try to understand the reasons why at some point, thanks to Balenciaga, thanks to Kvasalia, also Gucci partly, and all the others, the what was considered to be chavvy became fashionable once again. So I was interested because it's a good example to explain how fashion fishes from what is not conventional to create new trends. Now, from this point of view, it's very consistent with Prada. Prada is the brand that in the 90s launched the ugly chic. So fishing in ugly waters is perfect for Prada. Also, I found very interesting that they kept it very chavvy in the sense that they kept, obviously, the Prada logo is there, and also they kept the black and white. It's only black and white. The collection is not colored at all, so it really stays with this sort of Adidas idea. I've got an Adidas chavvy tracksuit, which is in the same colors that they have used. What attracted my attention was more the so I do agree with you 110% on this. What attracted my attention was the operation. So Prada is, as everybody that watches us will know, is a brand that has one core element. Sort of, we can say one sort of unique selling proposition, which is the nylon. Um, and in 2017, they operated a great return to nylon, which was playing on the fact that brands today are sort of rekindling their own heritage, reconnecting with their own heritage. So for them, nylon was heritage. But at the time when they had the first nylon collection, it was almost a scandal because everybody criticized Prada for doing so because nylon is unsustainable. Prada all of a sudden had a great product, their own nylon products, and had a great problem to greenwash themselves because they were all of a sudden being perceived as unsustainable for something that was not negotiable because they cannot negotiate nylon. That's the very core of Prada's identity, and therefore they came up with the idea of the re-nylon, a sort of a recycled nylon. Now, the reason why they're launching this collaboration with Adidas is because they are communicating through this collaboration to the world that they are 100% going sustainable on nylon. Now, for me, nylon is generally speaking a sustainable fabric, not because it's produced sustainably, but because Prada's nylon is very, very long lasting, and that's the only idea of sustainability, is to have long lasting garments for me. So that was already to me an idea that could be sold as sustainable. The fact that the nylon bags by Prada are very good quality, very long lasting. So that in itself is sustainable. It doesn't need to be produced sustainably, because even if you produce something sustainably, but you produce too much of it, it becomes unsustainable. I do think that this collaboration is good not aesthetically, but as a form of communication, because Prada needs to get to the masses and to young people and to communicate. It's a good way of doing a collaboration, not to make more money, but to communicate something new that the brand is doing. From a marketing point of view, I think is a winning strategy. I don't know from a product point of view because I didn't see the product in real life, but from a marketing point of view, I think it's a rather winning strategy. Sorry, carry on. You were saying you went to an exhibition.
Let's just edit and cut it, and we can keep it in one flow. Yes, so speaking of Prada and this market and message, I think it really stood out for me what brands today were trying to communicate. A lot of messages about sustainability, ethical practices, but actually, the big thing which is missing in all these sort of narratives is the fact that actually how sustainable and what do we mean when we say sustainable, and there's a lot of what we call greenwashing or just marketing strategies. So we read this article on biomaterials and about how fashion brands are looking to source natural, organic, biodegradable materials to produce fabrics and then garments out of these materials. And simultaneously, I went to see Waste Age exhibition at Design Museum recently. And maybe because I never kind of dived into this narrative that much, even though there's a lot of sources available, I felt like this exhibition was a little bit more of like a slap in my face, like a very huge slap, which I did not anticipate. I thought it's going to be all like we all need to recycle and be good humans, but it opened more profound conversation. It made me realize what every time we buy anything, it could be recycled, it could be made from renewable materials, we're still buying more. Like all these conversations about brands being ethical, sustainable, it does not reduce the amount of consumerism we have. We find ourselves in a consumer culture
It
today.
increases it.
What, sorry?
It increases consumerism. It doesn't
It
reduce.
increases, but on top of increasing, today, who is the person who rules the world? Today, the aspiration character is the person who has latest iPhone, who lives in a modern design flat, is the person who wears latest designer garments from latest collection. It's the person who is modern and contemporary. We are obsessed with latest digital trend. Is the person who posted the latest story on social media, is the person who visited this place, is the person who's been to this restaurant. It's all about having the latest, most desirable experience. And this is actually absolutely dysfunctional if you think about humankind on a bigger scale. We literally live in a world where if your phone is not up to latest software system, you can't use some apps, you can't download some things, you are on the edge of becoming obsolete yourself unless you strive to keep up with these trends. So therefore, we're not really having with sustainable solutions, which we call it, just marketing and ideas which are being sold to us about apparently better practice or more ethical consumerism, when in reality it is a constant chase of newness and desirable consumer products. And I realized what a lot of brands, even with exhibition, we suddenly started presenting a lot of designers. There was a lot of focus on fashion, saying, these designers use sustainable materials or were recycled. But simultaneously, what I understood, we also need to look at the fact that there are so many products which already exist, but we just move on. It is very easy to forget about things. And I thought that was actually a real challenge rather than constantly uh, pursuing brands which claim we have the best practice. We actually could think differently about things we already have and what we actually values, because essentially it's a system of our values which for me stood out as a big issue.
Yeah. When I said it increases consumerism, what I meant is precisely because brands are they have to sell, of course, their brands. They're not ONGs. They are they have to make a profit, but also consumers want to buy, and essentially is the brands are giving the people an opportunity of consuming as much as they were consuming before, even more, without feeling morally guilty. And as a result, they end up consuming more as opposed to consuming less. Because if you're buying something sustainable, why don't I buy two instead of one? Because it's sustainable. So the idea is always finding strategies to relieve the sense of guilt of consumers, as opposed to really finding a solution. But if you leave this choice to brands, um, then what do you expect? Brands have to sell. You cannot blame brands too much. You cannot even blame the consumers. I think if the governments want to impose some restrictions, they have to do it from above, because you can't leave the market, the brands free and the consumers free, and then expect that they behave differently. You know what I mean? So it's a very tricky story. Now, regarding this idea of new materials, now there is a lot of there are a lot of amazing discoveries, which unfortunately are not at their are still in their infancy. One new material that is worthy to be mentioned is the Pinatex. Is a sort of alternative to leather made of pineapples, but it's not very good. The problem with the fake leathers is that they are usually not very good materials. They are not strong enough to withstand stress, and they wear out pretty quickly. That's the reason why brands are not switching to eco leathers, because the quality is simply not good enough at that time. So Pinatex, but the latest is the mycelium, which has been is a sort of fake leather made of mushroom, and they have started a partnership with Hermes. Now that raised my attention, because Hermes does not play with simply greenwashing. Hermes does not need to sell more necessarily. They need to sell better. They are not based on the sheer scale, on the sheer amount of things that they sell, but on the price of the single item. So that caught my attention. If they start a partnership with mycelium, it must be a good material. But the one that I think is most interesting today, as a concept at least, is this idea of materials that sort of harvest carbon from the environment. So you turn the carbon emissions into plastic and other materials. And there is Pangaea that is already creating a pair of glasses that are made with this material that essentially is made out of the carbon of from the atmosphere. And also L'Oreal and some other companies are creating plastic packaging made with this carbon sort of hijacked carbon uh, from stolen essentially from the environment. So they turn pollution into material. Now the problem is, I don't know how sustainable this is to produce, because I know that that cement was being also produced with this technique, but is not necessarily is only one side of the story. There may be other waste that they produce, and that is one problem. I don't know how well implemented this is so far. And I'm very wary about companies like Pangaea. I mean, I love Pangaea. It's beautiful to watch and good quality. But I'm always a little bit wary when brands attach themselves to ethics so deeply and so much. So wary about this. Fashion brands, because fashion brands have to create fashion, have to sell, and the moment in which you attach it, you are setting yourself for disaster, I think, if you link yourself so intimately with a sustainable message. Another thing that I wanted to say is that it's very interesting how all these changes that brands do about sustainability, the ones that you were mentioning, etc., are based on consumers' opinions, right? They are based on surveys essentially. The problem is that surveys are not reliable in the first place, because surveys are questions that you ask to people, and people usually want to portray themselves as pure, as the best. They essentially lie, even if what they're saying is anonymous. I remember in the early 2000s and late 90s, when you would ask an Italian who do you vote for? They would never vote for Berlusconi. Nobody would be voting for Berlusconi, and he was constantly president because people were ashamed of saying the truth. And this is happening also with sustainability. If you look at the polls and at the surveys, everybody is ready to spend more for buying sustainably. Everybody is ready. But this is not really what happens when you offer them a sustainable option, usually. Okay, there is a brand, a German brand, I think it's German or Austrian, no, it's German, called Honest Buy, which was an entirely traceable brand, very sustainable. And it was essentially created to give the market what the market was asking for. And the brand struggled a lot because what people say they want to buy is not necessarily what they're gonna buy. And that has to do, this is a whole domain that I can't open now because it's too specific, but has to do with something that in consumer psychology is called a high level construal. You tend to think in terms of high level construal, in terms of values essentially, when the object is far from you. You tend to adopt a low level construal. In essence, you don't buy according to your own values when you are before the item that you're gonna buy. So chances are that if they ask you what type of things do you buy sustainably, I don't know, do you buy sustainable shoes, you would say yes if you are at home and you are answering a survey. But then when you go to the store and you have the shoes in front of you, the last thing you think about is sustainability. So
But yeah.
very complicated. It's a very complicated from a psychological point of view. The consumers are very complicated, and I think this brands should not trust consumers too much on this necessarily.
I think, yeah, it's absolutely true. Everyone wants to present themselves in a better light. But also simultaneously, we see and we know fashion industry exists because it plays on the individual portrayal of our identity and status symbol. So therefore, often always exciting initiatives about sustainability, recycling, ethical practices, they can look very enticing as a message to attract consumers. But when it comes to actual product, there are many cases when presented with a selection of various objects, consumer still goes for something which enables them to feel better, not only on the message level, but actually individual benefit. So that's why there are many solutions, for example, in technology, where so many brands came up with different phones. Like you had, there was a very prominent brand, Fairphone, and everyone was excited about it because you could repair it yourself. It was very minimal, very modernist. But in the end of the day, Apple and Samsung, everyone has their phones because there's something sexier, something more desirable and mystical about the consumer objects, which everyone wants. And often this is what sells in the end of the day rather than sustainability. And it is a very, very challenging issue for all consumer industries to tackle.
Absolutely, and this, in fact, is exactly. I always say this to my students, and I always insist on this concept. The fashion is a free floating signifier. Okay, it's a signifier with no signified. It's a shape with no meaning. The only message that fashion really sends out is "I am fashion." Every time you buy a fashion piece, the message that you're really buying is "I am buying fashion," even if you think you're buying sustainability. Because even when you think you're buying sustainability, they are offering you sustainability only because it's fashionable to do so. The real message is I am buying this because it's fashionable to do so. Therefore, I am buying fashion. The problem is that if you treat sustainability as a trend, as something fashionable, well, fashion pass. Fashion fashions tend to pass. Therefore, it's not really a winning strategy to approach sustainability as if it was another trend. It needs to be something structural. That's why I'm saying it needs to come from above. Brands themselves cannot be asked to find a solution alone, and you cannot blame the consumer too much. It's too easy.
Well, speaking of consumers, messages, and narratives, Don't Look Up movie from Netflix. It definitely communicated a lot of messages and I actually thought it was really brilliant. I was quite skeptical in the beginning because I thought it was going to be another Hollywood style movie, especially with the actors lead, which seemed to be kind of a key Hollywood actors with Jennifer Lawrence, Leonardo DiCaprio. But as I started watching it, I really enjoyed it, and I thought it was such a beautiful social commentary on the past maybe 5 years or so. It definitely looks on the first sight like some sort of a made up um, phantasmagoria story of society, which is not possible today. But as I started watching it, with each next sort of sequence of narrative, I realized this is a perfect reflection, maybe a little bit more exaggerated, but definitely it has a very true take on what society we live in today, and specifically absence of grand narratives, which is, it's not necessarily anything new, but it just proves it absolutely possible today to make you believe in anything. And it also possible to turn the absolute pristine truth into fake news. It's just all about how you tell stories, how you can back people up, how you can act on their emotions, their insecurities, their secret desires, and sell them exactly what we want. I thought it was brilliant. It managed to touch on so many culture gone bad aspects of contemporary society, which probably a brilliant masterpiece of work.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was interesting to watch because it's true. I also thought that this is a great metaphor for what we're going through right now, because there are two levels of interpretations of this movie. One is the movie as from the point of view. You can approach this movie from the point of view of how it updates the Hollywood genre of apocalyptic movies. Okay, this movie is one in a long tradition of movies such as like Independence Day, 2012, Armageddon, and all those catastrophic movies. But in those movies which cover the 90s and the early 2000s, you usually up until, let's say, 2014 maybe, um, what you have in those movies is always the same story. There is a great threat, usually coming from space, which will destroy Earth, just like the great extinction of the dinosaurs. But there is one country that realizes it first, the United States, and saves the world. In this case, the United States sees the problem, they don't understand it, they don't take action, they don't look at the bigger picture, they only look at the smaller picture, they don't save the world. This is the nail on the coffin of the United States as the savior of the world. The United States are not. But not only the United States, no other country, because in this movie, all countries are equally stupid. In this sense, it's an equal opportunity insulting movie. And the ultimate message of the movie is that humanity deserves extinction. Is extinction is essentially that's what the and this is the first level of interpretation. The second level, I thought, along the lines of what you were saying, is the destruction of the master narratives and the grand narratives. In this sense, this is a perfectly late postmodern movie. I thought postmodernity ended in 2001 with the fall of the Twin Towers, but then this movie shows me that postmodernity did not really end. It carried on and it became the parody of the parody that it already was, and now is a tragic parody. So before you have tragedy in history, and then the second time history happens is a farce. In this case, history happening the second time stops being a tragedy and um, stops being a farce and becomes a tragedy. And this is what this movie was showing. Essentially, the idea is that, and this is the reason why I think it really links to our present, is because there is no faith in science. Science is treated in this movie as any other system of belief, religion, politics. But the difference between science and a system of belief is that science is not based on belief. It's based on experiments and demonstration of that something is actually happening. You cannot reduce science to a system of belief. Otherwise, we live in an utterly radical relativistic world. But that's exactly what happens with no vaxxers, for instance, or with flat earthers, for instance. They have evidence, they discard the evidence, and they still look at reality as if it was a system of beliefs, not something that you can demonstrate with science. So, in this sense, the movie captured. And scientists are not believed, not even by politicians. The only moment in which scientists in the movies start to be listened to is when they become media personality, because there is also in the movie this overlap, constant overlap between the serious scientific issues and the mediatic sort of story. At some point, the character ends up in bed with a TV presenter, brilliantly played by Kate Blanchett, and yeah, it's rather depressing. And the end is very funny and depressing as well at the same time.
You know what? I think it also a great commentary on the fact what, especially with internet, if you're able to communicate your narrative in a alluring way, and you can get people to agree with you, and especially online. And since COVID, since lockdowns, people turned into online communities very intensely. And if you believe in something, anything, you can believe what, like you said, Earth is flat or what COVID is not real. There will be people online who will agree with you and you can join together. And it just shows what you don't need science in a way. Yeah, you can just trust anything which is being said to you. And I feel it was a perfect reflection on conspiracy theories, on Trump election, on contemporary politics, on vaccinations, on lockdowns, on protests, on social activism, on everything essentially. And even though it's exaggerated way, uh, on some levels of our society and some parts of the world, this is absolutely going on. And that's probably why it's a little bit disturbing, because you think it's a mockery, but when you try to draw parallels and look through what is being shown to us, you actually realize this is more closer to everyday life than we would like to accept.
Yeah, yeah. I think the this is something that Hitchcock used to do all the time. Very often, if you watch Hitchcock movies, the use of irony and farce and laughter is not used to make you to entertain you, but is used to cover up a drama. So if you remove the, I don't know, the funny line, you have a true drama that is too true and too dramatic to be said plainly, and therefore Hitchcock used to cover it with comedy. I think something similar was happening here. It would have been a very dramatic movie if they made the same movie about if they told the same story about without the laughter, because it would have been too close to reality. Laughter is what makes reality bearable sometimes.
Well, we have to laugh. That's all we can do to get through the tough reality sometimes. I guess you're absolutely right. Yeah, no, but I think it's a great movie. Very, very super fascinating reflection. And
And
it's just, yeah, to some extent,
the actors are amazing.
actors did really great. The characters variety is really profound. And actually, even, the way they address, the way they styled all of them, it also made them all very different and stand out and even more comical. Even the presidents, the way, or his son who said, I work in a White House and I have tattoo. Like, they all are using some visual signifiers to communicate their identity almost on a caricature level, which is also brilliant.
I somehow appreciated, which was consistent with the movie, was the fact that the president of the United States not only is a woman, but is also a Democrat. because at some point there is a picture of her hugging Bill Clinton. Now, this is relevant because it's not a movie that is taking a simple approach. There is a good side of the world, and then there is Trump. The approach of the movie is like approaching the entire world, left, right, Trump, the Democrats. Everybody is it's a total failure in this movie. The scientists, because they cannot make their points being heard, and everyone else because they're not able to take action. So it's attacks everybody in the same way. So it was, I don't know if it was a beautiful movie, but definitely it was a relevant movie.
Well, to me, it sounded like the guy who was looking after this social mindfulness app and mobile system is probably a winner. At least he was very convinced. So.
A friend of mine told me that that character is based on a real person who is an artist, and I didn't tell me who this real person is, because he knows it, him, and apparently is uncannily similar. So in order to craft the character, they had to really choose a real life model to make it believable, and it was pretty uncanny.
To me, all characters in the movie reminded me some characters incredibly closely, which was disturbing and eerie at the same time. Well, speaking of opposing opinions and different views, we read an interesting article about the fact that today in fashion, the narrative has shifted, and article argues that sex doesn't sell anymore. And in today culture, which has moved forward with new vision on body objectification and what previous aesthetics of sex were not relevant anymore. The article goes on to speak about Victoria's Secret failing from being the most watched live TV stream before. But then our article argues what in our culture we're still focusing on body display, and some sorts of a health obsessed body on display culture is still prevalent, but it's different. So therefore article goes on to conclude what voyeurism is something which is dominating our visual culture today. I really was fascinated by this article because I thought the article was trying to be quite edgy and, in a way, sort of shift our perspective of visual consumption. However, I think it missed a huge point, in my opinion, what today actually we still have element of sex and eroticism. It never goes away. Like this is as long as humanity exists, this aspect will always be present. However, what I think article fails to acknowledge, as time goes on, just like Sex in a City, things don't go away, they just evolve and change. And therefore, I would still assume, and I would argue, sex does sell. It's just a very different version. And voyeurism always existed. It's another aspect of eroticism. And if we need any further proof, well, we can go as far as to National Gallery and see all the paintings which both communicate eroticism, voyeurism, and sex. But the standards, the aspirations, and the little details, they just change just like fashion trends.
So, from a marketing point of view, I read some studies in which they try to test this idea whether it's true that sex sells or not. And what has been found is that sex does not really sell unless it's linked to something that requires sex, that is the body essentially, that is sexy. So, for instance, sex sells if you're selling a perfume, but it doesn't sell if you're selling a car. So if you're selling a car, that's not an intelligent way. Sex appeal has an impact, just like any other appeal. If you use creativity or fun, you obtain the same effect, unless you're selling perfumes, lingerie, and certain clothing brands, because they are precisely designed to increase sex appeal. those things that go close to the body. So sex sells, it depends in what the product that you're trying to sell is, essentially. Regarding the idea of the evolution of today's society, I very much agree with you. We convince ourselves that because we our society, especially the progressive side of our society, thinks that everything is socially constructed. Okay, that's another perversion of Foucault and Derrida. Everything is socially constructed. So if you stop mentioning something, it stops existing because things are created by a discourse, essentially, which is this whole obsession with inclusive language, for instance, the same thing. But that's not entire. That's not the entire story. The reason why we care about sex appeal is not because we are perverts and sexist. It's just because human beings require, for evolutionary reasons, to display themselves and to find mates. This is the reason why sex will always, in a way, appeal to the masses, especially if you're treating items like fashion items, etc. Because it's the same thing that you were saying before about status. Okay, sex appeal increases your own social status. In other words, it increases your chances to find a mate. There are amazing pieces by an evolutionary psychologist called Gad Saad about this, about how men and women tend to use appeal, different appeals, but essentially trying to obtain the same goal, finding a mate and increasing the possibilities of attracting, of being reproducing, essentially, even though we may not consciously think of it. And that's the reason why it's a sort of very hard kernel that cannot be undone in our society. And this poses the second problem, that is, we want to convince ourselves that everything is linguistically created. We want to convince ourselves that we are good, that we don't need to have sexually charged images, and therefore Victoria's Secret becomes all of a sudden unfashionable. But then, coincidentally, Ludovic de Saint-Sernin, which does the same thing, just using boys, becomes very, very popular. So how's that possible? Why one is wrong and the other one is not? And that is because they try to use different underpinnings for justifying their use of sex. They do still do the same thing, as you were saying, but they justify it in a different way that is more consistent with today's political agendas and progressive ideas. And I think to some extent there is a huge misunderstanding and a great deal of hypocrisy in doing this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's the same as, you can't post a nude painting on Instagram today, but users of Pornhub or OnlyFans are not going down, they're only increasing.
Right.
So our culture, again, likes to play with Victorian society, who are very proper on the surface. We know nothing about such kind of things. But behind the closed doors, everything is possible and available, and we can call it selling erotization, voyeurism. But you're absolutely right. In the end of the day, this aspect will never go away because humans beings are who we are. And it is quite ironic how the article tried to argue what our values have shifted from this aspect, when in reality they have not. It's just maybe the trends of how we present are changing. And we absolutely right to say what society wants to see themselves as being really good, holistic, wholesome, making right choices, and presenting their image as the most desirable one. But if you look at the statistics and facts, it's all the same. And if anything, digital is a vortex of erotization of our culture, which offers perpetual solutions to whatever fetishes or fantasies you have in your mind.
Yeah. So essentially, the good thing is the that no matter how vertical these messages are, how So no matter how much fashion brands try to shape society vertically by telling society what messages are correct and what are not, the good thing about capitalism is that the market will always decide. And as you were saying, if you are Instagram or Facebook telling consumers that they cannot do a certain type of thing, they will go to OnlyFans. And this has already happened when, do you remember when, what was that the social medium that at some point stopped nudes? Uh, what was it, a couple of years ago? It disappeared completely.
Tumble.
Tumblr, yeah, exactly. The moment in which they banned nudes, they disappeared. That was their unique selling proposition. They wanted to go towards. They wanted to portray themselves as the good one and morally, and not exploit sexuality, etc. They disappeared because the market goes where the market wants.
Yeah, because we don't want church to teach us moral lessons. I mean, we might do, but this is exactly where we go. And when we go online, we want to explore our fantasies and desires. And well, luckily for fashion, this is exactly industry which is built on selling us our desires, fetishes, objects we can identify with and adore, and the culture also supports it. So I think there's nothing is going away really. It all just evolves in shapes of different trends, and I'm very excited about what sort of events and things culture will bring this year, Jupi, so we can analyze, criticize, and be entertained by them.
Yes, and our listeners too, hopefully.
That's it.
So see you very soon.
Yes, and hopefully in person, COVID free.